Spy Cops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police that infiltrated over 1,000 groups since 1968. Episode 29, Roger Pearce and the Anarchists. Welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast. My name's Tom Fowler and I'm joined with...
Jessica from Police Spies Out of Lives.
Kate Wilson, also from Police Spies Out of Lives and core participant in the public inquiry. I think we're all core participants in the public inquiry, aren't we?
Ben, and I'm not really sure where I'm from, but I'm also a core participant.
This week, the Undercover Policing Inquiry started up again with its live evidence hearings. We've had 4 days of evidence this week. We're recording this on the Friday when the inquiry didn't sit. Started on Monday with the introduction of evidence for an undercover officer and some members of the public. And then we had some live evidence from Dave Morris and then from Steve Sorber, representing the Friends of Freedom Press, before on the Tuesday having the evidence of Roger Pearce. So that was HN85. He used the cover name Roger Thorley when he infiltrated anarchist groups in the early 80s, including Freedom Press. So the kind of the idea being is that on the Monday, they have the civilians who were infiltrated by the officer. And on the second day, they have the undercover officer themselves. So a lot of the stuff we heard introduced to Dave and Steve was stuff that they then put to Roger Pearce on the next day. So like kind of when covering like what happened, really, these 2 days go together. It was quite explosive in places, particularly from Roger Pearce.
I think Dave Morris was, as always, was amazing. And it was actually what I was quite surprised about was seeing sort of how Missing reacted to him. He was, I mean, at times Dave was having properly laughing, and it was just nice to sort of see like a little bit of kind of interaction from him, because I get the impression from sort of the way the inquiry deal with us on the whole is that they don't particularly like us, or that's the impression that I get. So it was nice to sort of to see that from Missing. But yeah, I mean, Dave, as always, is amazing, and I think he actually had some really difficult accusations that have been put to him in Roger Thorley's statement, and so he had to, for quite a lot of time, he felt like he was having to, his answers were just, that's absolute rubbish, and, that's nonsense. But yeah, he was fantastic.
I think it's worth saying that as far as I'm aware, Dave got the evidence from Roger Thorley really late.
Yeah, really late.
Dave doesn't remember Roger Thorley, and he was actually, in his witness statement, he was giving evidence about somebody else. I can't remember which. Was it Tony Williams?
HN20, Tony Williams.
Dave has done an incredible amount of work for this inquiry, largely because of how badly the disclosure has been handled and how late it's all coming. So he has made one statement for this tranche 2 part 1 that is happening now, and he's going to have to come back and make another statement once he's received all the disclosure and is able to answer the other parts of the questions that the inquiry is asking him. So he'd prepared most of his statement about spying on the London Workers Group and various other organisations that he was involved in. And then right at the end, he got this stuff from Roger Thorley. And Roger Thorley had basically said that Dave would have considered him a trusted friend, and that he was claiming that they'd gone together to like recce potential bomb sites at military bases. And I mean, it just like really out there stuff. And Dave was just like, I have no idea who this man is, and that is absolute nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just like kind of political stuff, but there was also things about like quite like personal sexual things about Dave's private life, which Dave was just laughing at. I mean, there was like a French woman and then like some sort of throuple thing, which just, I mean, it doesn't really sound like Dave. And Dave was just like, this is just absolutely ridiculous, made up stuff, And
of course, I mean, that was, I don't know if I'm giving away the punchline, but that was one of the big powerful things that came out of Thorley's evidence when he gave evidence was he was confronted with that, and he was just like, oh yeah, I don't know, Dave wasn't there. It's just, what the fuck, dude?
Yeah, I mean, it was like that thing. He described him as a trusted friend, and then when giving evidence, had to admit that he only actually spent time with him once on a trip to Cardiff.
Yeah.
So this trusted friend. I mean, it's part of this unraveling of something we saw from another couple of undercover cops of them, basically not getting that deep into the groups they were infiltrating and not getting that close to the people who they were pretending or they were spying on. That this seems to be over exaggerating what they managed to achieve. It's a bit of a theme.
You got to wonder, given what we now see of charisma and attitudes of these officers, it doesn't seem that surprising that perhaps they weren't able to penetrate both.
I mean, one of the things that when Roger Pearce actually gave evidence, and they managed to, and I think it was only a few days before Dave gave evidence, that they managed to find a document that actually had the names of like four redacted names on this document, where he's saying about how they went to recce this army barracks, and originally they hadn't given it to Dave unredacted, so he had to ask and say, I don't even know who these people are, I need to see the original document, and they showed it to him, and of course his name wasn't there. And then I think that document was then given to Pearce, so therefore he had to come back and say, well, yes, it wasn't, I remember, it wasn't him, and that wouldn't have been the sort of thing that he would have done. And he was actually quite sort of complimentary about Dave and Dave's principles and that, and he wouldn't have been the sort of person that done that. But it does sort of draw into, asks the question about, if they hadn't found that document, what would Pearce's evidence have been? Would he have doubled down on, yes, it was Dave? So this is one of the things that when the inquiry is saying they choose and they decide what documents are important, it's, they don't always have the right take on that, and thankfully that document was found, and and Thorley had to, or Pearce, whatever his name is, had to admit that yeah, okay, that was wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's very telling as well that that statement that he gave, where he referenced that, is 2 years old, and Dave Morris only got sight of it recently, only got that opportunity really at the 11th hour. It shows how the process is, once again, something we've been banging on about a lot on this podcast, how the process of the undercover policing inquiry is weighted in favour of police and ex-police officers.
Yeah, I think there was in what you were saying before, there's a slightly odd dynamic in the inquiry when people are giving evidence, that you have, as you said, the activists that were spied on give evidence first, and then the officers give evidence after that. And the reason that I understand it, why that is being done, is because the supposition is that this is an investigation into the activities of the police, and so the activists giving evidence are the accusers and the police are the defendants to a certain extent. And so the activists go first and they put the allegations, and then the police get to respond. But actually what's happening a lot is this kind of thing where because of the way that the questioning is being done, and because of this focus that the inquiry has on finding justification, you end up with accusations being put to Dave and then the police responding. It's an odd, this dynamic of who's being accused and who's defending themselves against accusations in this inquiry is quite complex. And I think we often find ourselves on the back foot on that, because the assumption is that the people who are being accused of wrongdoing are the police. Yeah. But actually the way that it's being done, there is this kind of, these accusations of wrongdoing against us, but we're not getting the same allowances or information to be able to defend ourselves that they are. So yeah, it's quite difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something which somebody mentioned just now about how Dave Morris didn't actually know Roger Pearce when he was deployed undercover as Roger Thorley. I mean, that went the same for Steve Sorber. So we had a day of evidence, and we had the introduction of evidence in the morning before either of them gave evidence from Albert Beale. So it was like kind of his witness statement was introduced. I mean, he was there; he wasn't called to give evidence, but someone else who was there who knew Roger Thorley as he thought he was whilst he was undercover and knocked around with him, knew him quite well, was Dave McCabe, who was a member of the Freedom Anarchist Collective back in the day. It's still an anarchist today. I was at both days of the hearings. Could have given much more insight. I mean, both Dave Morris and Steve Sorber said that that much of what their responses had been from talking to Dave McCabe. It kind of why the inquiry. I mean this. We've seen it already that the inquiry has like sort of like a celebrity approach to who it considers a worthy civilian witness. We get like if you're a lord or a professor or something, you're going to get called, whereas other people, us lowly mortals, might not. And it seems like the official person who still runs the printing press for Freedom, and like Dave Morris gets called, but like Dave McCabe, it's like, well, who is he? So he doesn't get called, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, to be perfectly honest.
No, I mean he was mentioned, so many times in Thorley's evidence, in his statement and stuff, and then and both of them saying that, at the time, it's like, well, I don't know, he's actually here today, so I don't know why these questions aren't, being asked to him. But yeah, again, there's nothing that came with that.
It was a bit weird because like we were all sat in the public gallery and there he was sat there like amongst us all, and he kept getting I think all of us just kept looking at him whenever his name was mentioned. I mean, like poor old Dave. It was just a bit surreal.
But yeah, so one of the things as well on the first day. I mean, I have sort of attended in person, and we're all given our assigned seating and that. So we were sat in the front bench, and this is where we were told to sit. And there's obviously like a 10-minute delay. So after about 15 minutes, we're getting texts from people who are watching the live stream saying that we're visible on the live stream. Like the cameras like had at least like the first 2 rows of the public gallery, and we're just streaming it. So, I mean, obviously I've got an anonymity order, so several of the other people that were there. But, they didn't, I mean, we had to repeatedly ask them to, to do something about it. So they actually sort of panned away from us. It was a good 3 hours before they actually took the footage down. And it's, again, I mean, it certainly feels to me like, it's one rule for them and one rule for us. If it was an undercover officer that had anonymity that was filmed, I'm sure that they'd have taken it down straight away. But once again, it's we came off badly because of the inquiry and their attitudes towards us. So this is something that just feels like it's been at every opportunity, like we're disregarded. So not only do we not get the disclosure to write our own statements. I think I got mine like 2 weeks, the last bit 2 weeks before I had to have my statement in. But yeah, it still feels like a very unfair process, but it's, I mean, in actual fact, it's worked well for, like Kate said, with having Dave give evidence first and then sort of like Thorley having to just like roll back on several of the things that he said. But yeah, still the process still for me it's not working.
It struck me that not only did Dave pull this admission out of the bag at the last moment, having been given the disclosure at the last moment, which he could have easily have missed, and he had time to actually deal with it, which many people wouldn't have, but he stuck to his guns. At no time did it cross his mind to apply for privacy restriction orders in the face of ridiculous accusations. And I can totally understand why other people have. They balked at the idea of trying to defend themselves against an accusation made decades ago with, not even necessarily knowing who your accuser is, not having been able to see the evidence behind this accusation. So it's understandable that people have simply said, I don't want my name appearing in this when this officer is talking about these reports, because it's really quite potentially serious allegations. So Gates Dave, going off to recce a bomb plot seems pretty serious. So for him to have faced that accusation at the last moment and then got this admission that it was made up, it was a mistake, is amazing. But I'd like to think that maybe other people will look at that and think, you know what? Yeah, it's ridiculous. I'm going to just face it down. I'm going to face it down.
Yeah, fair play to him.
So it struck me, I mean, we're talking about this alleged bomb plot and recce and stuff that Dave wasn't involved in. I think it's worth saying that, the Roger Thorley or Roger Pearce didn't admit to making the whole thing up. He admitted that Dave wasn't there. And I think it's worth noting that Roger Pearce single-handedly appears to have uncovered more potential bomb plots than the entirety of the rest of the STS in all of its existence. And there doesn't appear to be any actual evidence for any of them. That he was asked at the end of his questioning, whether anyone had ever actually been prosecuted for any of these bomb plots that he uncovered, and he admitted that they hadn't. And I mean, we'll come on to the tone of his reporting and indeed the tone of his fiction writing, which I think has a lot to do with the tone of his reporting in a bit. But I think it is worth making that point because, yes, he said that Dave wasn't there, but he hasn't actually admitted to making the whole thing up.
Given that Roger Pearce was forced to admit at least one really major piece of misinformation in his witness statement, and given that he also admitted that none of his reporting about supposed bomb plots had led to any prosecution, you really, really have to wonder how it was that a guy providing such useless, low value or worthless intelligence was promoted all the way through the ranks to become literally the top brass of the intelligence unit.
What they do with really bad people, it's just we don't want them. I know, let's promote them. There'll be someone else's problem. Maybe it was that.
Falling upwards. Most of when Dave Morris, just to wrap up on Dave, and most of the time he was talking, he was giving evidence about the London Workers Group, which was spied on by HN20. That was Tony Williams, who we heard the summary of evidence about. He's dead now. We still don't know his real name because the inquiry gives anonymity even to the dead if they're police officers. It was pointed out by Dave that when the inquiry got in touch, initially they just told him there was an undercover officer in the London Workers Group. They didn't say who it was. Now Dave said that he kind of worked it out eventually, but at first there was there was a lot of internal sort of things about it. So the first person he thought it turned out not to be. And this thing this is a real problem that comes from the not releasing the cover names in a lot of cases. So there's a huge number of the undercover officers, particularly in this tranche, where we don't know their cover names. And it means that people are unsure who the undercover officer was in their group. They know their group was infiltrated. They don't know who it was. And it causes quite a lot of trauma, a lot of stress for people. That kind of pointing of fingers kind of happens. Unfair, unnecessary, and really entirely the fault of the inquiry. It's one of the ways in which the inquiry really kind of furthers the trauma that undercover policing kind of impacts upon people. Yeah, just to wrap up on Steve's evidence, really, he was, a member. I mean, still is involved with Freedom Press. He was part of the editorial group back then, and it just took through his times. Some of the things that were put to him was so the Friends of Freedom Press was set up as a means of separating off the assets of freedom, the premises and the printing press and all that stuff, finances of it, away from the running of the group itself. So this was put forward by HN85 Roger Pearce as some sort of secretive thing that means that the state could never take the building off the anarchists, or anything that kind of any legal instruments sort of take it off them. And it was a secretive way of siphoning funds in some way. I mean, as Steve Sorber pointed out, that's not legally possible just because it's a separate entity. If the state really wanted to get to take those things off freedom, this sort of arrangement wouldn't wouldn't affect that. He says merely just so that because there's such an open organization that, he didn't want a new group to come along and end up selling the building for some petty reason. Yeah, it's kind of quite a normal sort of. It really illustrated the way in which, like, the undercover police, like particularly Roger Thorley, he was very good at like kind of reporting some fairly innocuous stuff as something like sinister and secretive, and making it sound like he kind of found out something. Yeah, and he was asked a lot about. There was a whole bunch of it about the Little Black Book, which was some sort of anarchist in the same tradition as Towards the Citizens Militia, or even the Anarchist Cookbook, which never ended up getting published, but everybody got nicked for nearly publishing. It wasn't a new book; it was an American book. Yeah, so I mean, there was we went through a lot of Roger Pearce's reports. We started going through them then before we heard from him, and there was a lot of really a lot of derogatory. A lot of derogatory language, a lot of asides, a lot of like sarcastic comments, a lot of stuff that, really doesn't, unnecessary. Some suggestions, some allegations about people that didn't stack up at all.
It's interesting, like Wilson said earlier, it's listening to what he was saying. You couldn't really go anywhere in London without like tripping over a bomb.
Yeah.
It was oh yeah, and there was a bomb in this theatre, and then there was one on a train. And then there was one found by some tracks, and then
there were two theatres in his witness statement. There were there were 5 of them in total, and he got questioned about them. And there was one. He was like, they were like, "Can you tell us about this bomb in the theatre in Holborn?" And he was kind of blustering a bit and asking them for more information. And eventually, the guy cross-examining him said, "Well, actually, the only information we have about this supposed bomb threat is from your witness statement, and we haven't found any contemporary reporting about it at all, and we have no idea what it refers to." And he was like, "Oh, I can't really remember anymore." When he came across that he was just making stuff up, and I thought it was particularly funny that he was questioned about his role in Freedom Press. So we heard with Stephen Sorber, we heard about how he'd taken an editorial role in the newspaper, and he'd published articles, and they had actually found a bunch of the articles that he'd written for Freedom Press, and some of them were quite interesting. When the inquiry came to question Roger Pearce about his role in this newspaper, and they were like, what about freedom of expression and freedom of journalistic expression and the state's interference in that? And he basically said, but they weren't journalists, they were propagandists. This wasn't reporting. And the inquiry barrister really had to point out that actually, all journalistic freedom is about being able to express your ideas and try to bring people round to your ideas. And it's not like if you're writing and trying to convince people of right-wing stuff, that's like journalistic freedom of expression. But if you're trying to convince people of left-wing or anarchist stuff, then that's propaganda. And that really kind of brought it home, the prejudice that is so deeply ingrained in the whole existence of the SDS that he didn't even see it.
I looked around me as he was talking about that. The distinct lack of journalists in the public gallery covering this inquiry, and one of the very few that was someone from Freedom Press. So it was like, funnily enough, like there's not many journalists around these days, but they're still there, despite being infiltrated by the police. When we did come to Roger Pearce giving evidence on the Tuesday, something that was, it was talked about very very early on, but it was evidently clear by how comfortable he was in the environment that he passed the bar in the 1970s, and before he became an undercover police officer, he was a fully qualified lawyer. This meant that he has certain confidence in a way of answering questions, which meant he was willing to argue. He kind of argued a point and then said, well, if you don't accept that argument, here's another argument. Basically, I mean, he defended everything he did. There was a few occasions where he was really pushed by Barr, where he had to just, like you're saying about that one bomb he talked about, where he literally just said, "Well, I withdraw it." He was just like, "I can't defend that one because there's nothing else for me to work with," basically, and he just withdrew it. You've just been caught kind of making something up, but you've just like jump over that and talk at length about the other thing. The fact that he was a qualified lawyer meant that like his whole thing about like breaching legal professional privilege, he was like fully aware of that, absolutely fully aware of that. And he kind of launched on this thing that there was a whole bunch of stuff that he was fully aware about, you shouldn't spy on MPs, and you shouldn't interfere with journalists, and, you shouldn't be an entrant provocateur, and you shouldn't breach a legal professional privilege. But as Barr pointed out, you did all these things a lot. Like, that's kind of what you were doing. So how do you square that circle?
Did he say at one point, it was for other people? He just made a note of everything, and it was for other people to filter it out.
Which, I mean, it was quite interesting because, before he was deployed into the field, part of his job had been to what they call top and tail the reports, the field reports by undercover officers. He said that he never edited the content, and he was never aware of any content of reports being edited. They simply put the necessary like information at the top and the information at the bottom, and filed it away, passed it on to special branch or whoever. I think that's something which bears a bit of examination. The relationship between the special demonstration squad and the security services. We really saw the way in which, it came very clear when all this stuff first started. We were kind of a bit like wary to use this term because, let's wait and see. But I think, from what we've heard from Roger Pearce, this is Stasi Britain, that basically the Special Demonstration Squad were working for MI5. MI5 were issuing like kind of lists of questions. They call them shopping lists as part of we've talked about this before on the podcast. The Special Demonstration Squad had their own internal language. They were the Hareys, their targets were the Wearies, and the requests from MI5 were shopping lists. And we really saw David Barr, QC. I haven't always been complimentary about him, but I think he did a very good job that day. He did a really good job of sort of showing how, like, here's a shopping list from MI5. Here's your report, and you're answering those. The report is written to answer those questions. Yeah, that customer relationship like really came through very, very clearly. And Roger Pearce was, by the time, was meeting with MI5 agents on like every couple of months from fairly early on his deployment going forward throughout his career.
Didn't always tell his bosses either, it seems.
Right. Yeah.
I think he had I was a bit confused about who he was actually working for and what he should have actually been doing.
And I think that's going to be really interesting when they bring him back as a manager as well, because, this man went on to be promoted to be Special Branch's Director of Intelligence, I believe.
Yeah.
And, we've seen him tick every single box pretty much whilst he was working undercover. And then, and as Ben says, like he was produced. It was drivel. There was a long section of the cross-examination where David Barr just read his reporting to him, and then and he just, his answers over and over again were, no, yes, I guess that wasn't really appropriate. No, that wasn't at all appropriate. No, that has no intelligence value. No, absolutely no intelligence value. No, that has no intelligence value at all. And it was just like, what were you doing? And that kind of segued into just when you thought it couldn't get any worse for Roger Pearce and his legal team. David Barr then started reading extracts from his fiction novels. And there's a clear line of travel between his intelligence reports, which he himself admits were largely written to entertain the officers working in the back room rather than for any intelligence value that they might have had. And, the dark side of that is that what he thought that the people in the back room were going to find entertaining was basically racist and sexist jokes.
Which he said got no reaction. They got no reaction. The fact that he was making these constant, like, sarcastic little, offensive jokes. He was like, was this for amusement of those reading it to get a reaction? He was, oh no, there wouldn't have been any reaction to any of it. Just like, oh, come on, mate, it's bollocks.
Which is also interesting because if it was true, which it clearly isn't, that he was getting no reaction, you would have thought that he would have questioned his choice of his future career as a fiction writer and for entertainment purposes. If everyone was just saying, go away, Roger, you're dull, you're boring, you're obnoxious, you're a bigot at the SDS safe house, if they were saying that, then maybe he wouldn't have gone on to write fiction, thinking that he, was going to do good at it. But no,
he left the police force and he started writing novels. And one assumes it's because he found good reception for the fiction that he was and the entertainment that he was providing for his handlers.
I mean, the other thing is it really fits into, there's a house style for the SDS. We see it in the tradecraft manual. We've seen it in the reports from other officers. This isn't just, it's not just Roger Pearce, right? This is how they reported the bigotry, the bawdy humor.
It's not just Roger Pearce, but I think it is worth saying that it isn't all of them. But what it is, and I think this is significant, is it's the ones we know most about. And why do we know most about them? Because it's the ones like Roger Pearce, like Bob Lambert, like Andy Coles, who went on to do well in the unit, who went on to get promoted in the unit, who went on to train other officers. You know, they're the ones that produced this tripe are the ones that did well. You know, whereas the ones that were maybe reporting a little bit more accurately, and I mean, Dave Morris in his witness statement makes some comparisons between Tony Williams's reporting, which is quite, you know, dry and straight up, just reporting what was going on, and as a result didn't really go anywhere because there wasn't much to report. So unless you were sensationalizing it and fictionalizing it, and we're going to see it again when we get to, you know, the more famous officers in the MPOIU like Mark Kennedy, is that, you know, the people who did well were the ones who sexed it up.
That's actually an SDS choice of words, I think, is sexing it up. When they weren't sexing up the activists, they were sexing up their reports. Once again, you know, there's all the derogatory comments and things that he made about, you know, about women. It's something that just runs through like all of the reports, and that it's just the attitude.
I mean, yeah, there was a lot of pejoratives from Roger Pearce. A lot of his stuff really was, you know, of no particular interest. And he was going to these editorial meetings, which were very practical sort of meetings about what was going in the paper. And he just used his reports to talk about the endurable tedium. And he was saying that, you know, he was bored while he was there. And he found that he was very irritated. He talked about like going to some parties and there being some anarchists that were there who were really ill-mannered and uncouth, and they smelt, and they were only there for the booze anyway. And when he's asked why he's done this, you know, David Barr was like, he said, "Oh, it was true, though. It was true." But David Barr's like, "So what? Doesn't matter if it's true. Like, why are you doing? What is this? Do you think this is a proper use of police resources? Like, on recording the fact that some anarchists at some meeting were really rude to you, you know." This is something as well we have about, like, there's a lot of his reporting about women, and his defense on the day on Tuesday was just like, well, she'd come on to me numerous times. Oh, like and he reported on people being homosexual. Well, they'd come on to me. And it's like, so this is why you've reported on them. This is revenge reporting that, you know, somebody, number one, I don't believe that everybody's throwing themselves at you, Roger. This is just seems to be like your own personal, like, you know, myth of yourself. But secondly, if they had and you rebuked them, why are you so angry with them? What is your problem? Why are you such a fucking dick? Why do you have to be so horrible about everybody? And why are you putting this into official reports? It's incredibly unprofessional. He did it as well with race. I mean, a lot of his reports used racial terminology. He's talking about the blacks as a pejorative, referring to them as like a criminal element, an inevitably criminal element. Suggest there was nothing political about any of the black-led campaign organizations of which he spied upon. Reporting like the racial makeup of, sort of, if there was a black barrister, or if there was a police officer who was black, always mentioning it. There's a lot of like really distasteful stuff. He talks about like how, you know, it was a different time. This is the thing we've heard again and again.
And I think you're a bastard back then, the same as you're a bastard now. I don't think like I think 40 years has made any difference, Roger.
Whilst he was like slagging off people, when he couldn't help but just defend himself from everything on Tuesday. So like when it came to, you know, some really derogatory stuff about women, about the one particular woman who, you know, said she was almost feminine. He said, "Oh, this was self-mockery. These are things she would say about herself." And I was simply reporting on them. It's like there's no suggestion whatsoever. There's nothing in the report that suggests there's anything other than your opinion about this woman, which is wholly unacceptable, totally unprofessional to include, and of no intelligence value whatsoever. There's one bit where he talks about somebody being thrown out of freedom for making what he calls a wholly appropriate sexist comment. It's put to him what sort of sexist comment is wholly appropriate, and he said, "Oh, no sexist comment would be wholly appropriate to him. He was simply reporting on what some of the anarchists thought." And he'd already established that like sexism was not tolerated within the group, and that they wouldn't go to like pubs where the topless barmaids were. That everybody had to go to a different pub, which he moaned about. That then suddenly he's going, "Oh no, there was some sort of internal debate about sexism within the group," which there was no suggestion of. Though it's very clear the way he'd written stuff, but he couldn't help but try and defend himself. At one point, Barr goes to him, "You're in danger of defending the indefensible here." And he realized he was just on shaky ground and had to like concede that it was wholly inappropriate.
Was that the same woman that should have come with a government health warning? I think was that one of his other sort of like little phrases.
Yeah, and I mean, with that one, he just couldn't help but defend it. He was going on about how, like, oh, well, she lived in a squat where there was animal feces on the floor, which I don't believe. I've been to so many squats over the years. I've never seen animal feces on the floor of a squat, like just there, And this idea that, like, kind of it would be disgusting to have sex with this woman and like trying to defend it. And then, like, David Barr was like, well, why is this in your report? What relevance does any of this have to police intelligence? To which he just, I mean, there is no answer to that because there isn't.
I mean, the man was absolutely vile, but what I thought was quite interesting in the dynamic was that he would, with report after report, and this kind of line of questioning went on for quite a long time, where David Barr would pull out a vile report and read it to him, and then they'd go, it'd go down till eventually Roger Pearce admits that no, it had no intelligence value. Yes, it is entirely inappropriate. And he might try and defend why he'd put it in or claim that it was true or whatever. But he was like, accept that it shouldn't have been in there and that he'd probably put it in there to be entertaining, or because that was just how people talked back then. I mean, he was very adamant that, in the 1980s, everybody was sexist and racist. And then each time, Barr would take that line of questioning and say, so was that the culture in the SDS then? Or, were those the kind of jokes that people would be laughing at? And is that the kind of language that you would hear? And we got to the point where Roger Pearce was saying that absolutely everybody in the 1980s would have made sexist comments and referred to the black community as the blacks, except the police. He never once heard sexist or racist comments within the police. It was just so ridiculous. And it was like you could see in the same way that he couldn't help but try to defend himself, he would go down these lines of questioning and answer in response to himself. But when he was asked to answer honestly about the police force, that instinct to defend all wrongdoing by the police kicked in, and he would just totally turn around. The answer, he was like, yes, it's inappropriate. No, it shouldn't have been there. Yes, it was for entertainment. Oh no, nobody would have laughed. No, nobody in the police would have made racist comment. It was just nonsense.
To see if he actually does come back. I mean, he is due to come back, but considering, the shit show that it was, giving evidence, I'd be surprised to see him come back, unless he thinks he can do better next time. But he's not gonna, I think he's dug. Who was it? Was it Donald said, he's digging his own grave and then he's filling it in behind him, which I thought was a lovely way of describing how like the evidence he was giving.
He's certainly not one to learn his lessons or be pushed aside by people's disgust. I noticed that when he was being questioned about his book, his Agent of the State, he was asked what the reaction had been from his colleagues, much like the question about the reaction to his sexism and jokes in the SDS safe house. He said he wasn't aware of any reaction at all.
I wouldn't have reacted either. They were fucking shit. There was a lot of his reports that, I mean, like we talked about being sexed up earlier. Like he talks about the relaunch of the Angry Brigade, which just did not seem credible. We had a report from like one meeting where there's all this talk about violence, and you're like kind of as if like people are about to launch some sort of armed group and take part in like assassinations and stuff. And then you actually drill down what the meeting is that he was reporting on, and it was a debate. Like it was like a set debate between violence and political violence and political non-violence, which meant it was very easy for him to take things that are being said completely out of context to make it sound like, rather than being like a philosophical discussion between anarchists, it was like a secret plan to like launch some sort of terrorist activity. I mean, he had this thing about like pirate radio stations. He reported heavily on like to shut down pirate radio stations, and like he would talk about the violent anti-police message of some of these radio stations, which was, you know, very thin. The idea that they were political endeavors was, you know, a bit of a stretch. Do you know what I mean? It was just they were something that he could project like kind of political subversion onto, really. I mean, and this is something we see throughout, right? I mean, like he had some of his reports from when he first started, when he first went undercover, he went into local anti-nuclear groups and he was reporting on planned street theatre, which then got like violently broken up by the police. Mundane activity, which, if you were to read his report, sounded like it was the beginning of an insurrection.
If you have something that's broken up by the police, it doesn't matter what it was or what it intended to be. You now have a public order situation, which is the, you know, the excuse and justification for so much of the targeting by the spy cops. There's so much of this kind of self-justification in order to just continue a single deployment, continue a single operation, continue all the operations, and continue the existence of the unit.
Kate was saying earlier about how he wrote articles for Freedom. And he didn't just write articles in an honest way, if you know what I mean. So he started off, he was writing about legal stuff. Obviously, he's a trained lawyer, so, you know, he had like a handle on it. And like he does one about like jury trials, something which actually is coming up again more recently with the Just Stop Oil stuff, the freedom that juries have to acquit. He says in that it's, you know, the British legal system is now so corrupt, you're better off just pleading guilty and getting it over with, which is, I'm sure, is like an ideal sort of message for an undercover police officer to like spread amongst anarchists. Just plead guilty, guys. The majority of his articles was about the political situation in Northern Ireland, and he took what was then a very contentious line, particularly within the Freedom Anarchist Collective, editorial collective, the people who put the newspaper together, where he was very supportive of the provisional IRA. And this was a time when, like, the Irish Republican movement was dismissed by anarchists as like a nationalist movement, a chauvinistic, of anti-democratic, of, you know, all the criticisms that anybody who's familiar with anarchist politics will know of any sort of nationalist movement, particularly one that operates in a parliamentary level. You know, the gangsterism basically that kind of goes along with it. And like by doing this article, it led to Freedom putting like an editorial alongside it, saying, you know, that the anarchist, how contentious it was, which led to letters from Belfast Anarchist Collective to Freedom saying, oh, you know, you people need to come to Belfast and understand the situation, which led Roger Pearce to be able to infiltrate things in Northern Ireland, which it would appear had a big catalyst on his successful career. But more than that, like more than the sort of his escape into the Northern Ireland thing, it was about him bringing out the differences and the splits that existed within the collective. And it's something we see with like numerous undercover officers, of them like trying to destabilize groups, really, by like bringing forth the ways in which people disagreed and the contradictions that existed within the group.
That is a really big deal, and we are going to see more of it, I think, of spreading divisions and basically undermining people's ability to organise by basically preventing them from being able to get on with each other and stoking these fights. But even, you know, this issue of getting into positions of influence, of creating political content and doing things that change the course of how things happen, even, you know, where that's not necessarily disruptive. And I mean, some of the stuff that we see later on, like in Mark Kennedy around some of the G8 stuff, where he's pretty much saying to his handler, like, unless we do something, these muppets are not going to pull this off. So I need to borrow some money from the operational funds to make sure this happens. And it's like, what the fuck are you doing, mate? Like, basically, it's people's right to politically organise is also our right to have the internal arguments that we want to have without state interference, and it's our right to, you know, organise something badly and fuck it up without state interference. Like this, they shouldn't be interfering. They shouldn't be influencing the way people's right to associate and right to organise goes. It particularly bothers me. I mean, it's something Mark did a lot, which may be why it particularly bothers me. But, you know, writing articles, writing chapters for books, doing radio interviews, creating political content that feeds into the politics of the movie. It's just like, fuck off. Get the fuck out of my political organising. You know, you want to report on what people are doing. You want to listen in. You want to sit in the meeting, but just fuck off from actually getting involved.
I mean, fuck off from all of it. Let's be clear. Fuck off from all of it.
But there's something particularly toxic for democracy about that. There's something very nasty going on when there's police officers being paid to get involved in people's political organising in ways that you know, that aren't just observing, but actually change the direction that things go in. And it's really clear that happened. And the inquiry, I think something that's worth saying about Roger Pearce, I mean, we found Tuesday, particularly Tuesday afternoon, and if you're going to watch any of the videos that the inquiry has posted, I would very much recommend watching Tuesday afternoon.
It's day 5 of this phase.
Yeah. It really felt to me that something has shifted in the inquiry. All of the things that we've been saying about why these spy cops were in the wrong were coming out really clearly, but what was maybe more important was that it was obvious that the inquiry understood them.
Interestingly, Meeting didn't thank Roger Pearce, did he, after he finished giving his evidence, which is, you know, which is unheard of, I think.
I mean, I think he was pretty bloody exhausted, mind it. I mean, the hearing ran until 7 o'clock at night. So Roger Pearce claimed that he was only really in the Freedom Editorial Collective because it was really good cover for access to the rest of the anarchist movement. Like the vast majority of the reports he was writing were on a group that wasn't really a target in any way. But he said it was because the MI5 had such a hunger for information about anarchists that reporting on anything was of value, including entirely innocent things. So we see a lot of his reports, including some incredibly long ones that like kind of listed all the contact details of anybody who was buying a book from Freedom Bookshop, anybody who had written a letter to Freedom newspaper. You know, huge swathes of information, and it's part of this, like this whole sort of this really wide cast of the net. It was put to him that like there was reports of him reporting on the birth of a child from some activists, and then they reported on a death of one of the printers before Freedom took printing in house. His net was cast so wide it went from the cradle to the grave. There was a lot of stuff about the aftermath of the Brixton riots. There's this sort of like. Obviously, there was like a police line about the Brixton riots that it was organised by international anarchists rather than being a spontaneous result of Operation Swamp. Pearce obviously is fully aware of the fact that like history shows that's actually what it was. So he tries to pretend that his reporting, he was trying to correct the police from stopping them to coming out with this wild conspiracy theory. I mean, it doesn't necessarily follow from his reporting that that's actually what he was doing. But what he does do is breach legal professional privilege over and over again, making up false links between an anarchist who happens to be Italian and then like the Red Brigades and like various forms of illegalist activity in Italy, which he said there's no real connection to it. You know, information on their defense campaigns. And we got on then to like the organising of Stop the City. Now, Dave Morris had been involved with Stop the City. And Dave Morris had said the previous day that like some of the people who Roger Pearce claimed were like the main organisers had literally nothing to do with it. One of those people was Ian Bone. Now, Roger Pearce was like asked about Ian Bone. He said, look, the Stop the City protests were kind of pacifistic in nature. They kind of really like pulled on the peace movement as a major part of the kind of the activism that was taking place on those days. Do you think that Ian Bone would involve himself in pacifistic activity? To which Roger Pearce, very sagely, said, I think knowing him, I think that he would. And I mean, like, this just shows a complete lack of knowledge of the anarchist movement of the 1980s. Like, I would say probably like page 1, line 1, if you wanted to like kind of get an idea of what the anarchists were like in the 1980s, like who, like kind of some main names, you know, Dave Morris we're very likely to organize a big day of action that was pacifistic in nature. Ian Bone, very unlikely to do that. Pearce got that so wrong. I mean, I think up until that point, he was like cosplaying as someone who had a real handle on the situation and was just lying about it because he was trying to hide something. When he came out with that, I was like, oh, he's lying about it. And he hasn't got a fucking clue either. Just to get it so completely wrong. Yeah, quite impressive almost.
I think this stuff that you touched upon around the Brixton riots is really, really interesting. The intelligence reports are clear. The police were aware of exactly why the Brixton riots happened. They happened because of social inequality, they happened because of racist policing, and they happened because of poverty in the Brixton area. But primarily, they were kicked off and targeted by racist policing and by police brutality. Then what they did afterwards was they picked a couple of people who were arrested on the day. And as Tom said, one of them happened to be Italian, a young Italian woman. It was absolutely clear from all the reporting that they knew that these people didn't have a role in kicking off the riot, and of just how clear it all was. Like the special branch need for a narrative about the Brixton riots that wasn't racist policing. And, they brought the Red Brigades and Italian terrorists, and, they created this whole show that was all smoke and mirrors to distract attention from their own failings. But it was all done at the expense of real people who spent time in prison.
Roger Pearce is a writer of fantasy, not just as a police officer, but also as an author. And David Bard took us to some extracts of his book, starting with his 2012 book, Agent of the State, which includes some very racy stuff. Really notably that the main character, John Kerr, apparently, has a sexual relationship with one of the activists he's spying on, female activists he's spying on, and then has a child with her. This was not something, according to Roger Pearce, this is something that he dreamed up entirely in his imagination, because he was never aware of such a thing happening whilst he was deployed, or whilst he was a member of the unit. Just to recall that we now know of 4 children who were fathered by undercover officers at the time when he was in the unit. But he claims he had no knowledge of this, that he dreamt it up in the 90s. And although this book came out in 2012, after which we'd heard at least one officer, Bob Lambert, having a child whilst deployed undercover, he claimed that he'd already written that storyline in the 90s, and it was just pure coincidence that it ended up being entirely true. Yeah, I mean, what a prescient writer. Quite amazing, really. We've taken through loads of aspects about individuals in his book who, once you've seen his reports and the cast of characters he was actually spying on, the cast of characters in his books are pretty obvious that it's drawn entirely from that. He wrote some fantasy reports, and now he's fantasizing them even more. In this book, he also kills people and does some sort of horrendous things, which we don't think that Roger Pearce actually did. He certainly glorifies the sexual relationship between an undercover police officer and female activist. He said he gave no thought, because obviously he knew about this being an actual thing before it was published, but it was already written, so it's too late to change it. But he didn't give any thought to how any of the women might feel about him writing a book, like an entertainment book on this topic, and profiting from it, or even how the child of Bob Lambert, TB is his cipher at the inquiry, would feel about any of it. Has anybody else read any of them? Or, I mean, I've only heard what was read out at the inquiry, which was pretty bad enough.
Yeah, I got 2 pages into it, and yeah, that was as far as I could manage. So I don't know what happened in his book.
There's a bit in one of them where he kind of makes reference to what very blatantly is the Leveson inquiry. So that's his second book, The Extremist, which I think is 2014. So this is, about the phone hacking, and there's stuff, but he said, no, that was written back in the 90s. It's like, wow, you've predicted all the things that happened in just a couple of years before you published your books. Over a decade earlier. It's quite impressive. Just like no one's believing you, Roger.
Shall I read a passage that was read out in the hearing?
Oh, Jesus, if you must.
Please do.
Their lives had converged at a meeting in Brighton, organised by a radical left-wing group called the International Prisoners' Aid. Keir had studied Robin's secret special branch file and targeted her from the first day. On the final evening, they had spent 4 hours getting drunk and 15 minutes having sex in the back of his van. By the time Robin tracked John, blah, 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 5 months pregnant with Gabby, he had spotted her walking into the yard behind the car spare shop in Southall, where he'd had his cover employment and his blood had frozen. Congratulations, he said. I think that's him, the hero of the book, discovering that one of his targets had got pregnant when he slept with her in the back of the van.
That could be then like HN67's one night stand that he claimed that he had.
Something really significant about that is at the beginning where he studies her special branch file and then uses that to target her for a relationship and ends up in bed with her at the end of the evening, because that's something that we've been saying all along, that this is what they're doing, and the police have kind of denied it. And there's this idea that these relationships are all somehow opportunistic, and I don't think they are. I think that there is, a direct line between the intelligence that is held on us and the intelligence that is gathered on us by other police and other undercover officers, and how that is used to then create these deceptive relationships. And I think that that's the kind of detail that's in his book, and it's not in his book because he's imagined it.
Well, that's the funny thing. It turns out that there's actually more truth and reality in his fiction books than in his intelligence reports.
He talks about the affirmative inaction of the top brass of the Met Police when it comes to revelations about wrongdoing within the force. Which, again, and this is one of his supposedly entirely prescient passages about like the way in which the Met Police responded to the scandal of undercover policing. And he said that there would be a lot of bluster, a lot of words, but nothing would actually change. And it's put to him by David Barr, is this actually the truth? And this would just be the perception. It's just the perception of certain officers at the time. But it's blatantly true. That's exactly how the Met Police top brass operate. Affirmative inaction. I thought it was quite a good term.
Maybe it is actually an official term.
I mean, there's so much that could be said about Roger Pearce. I think we're going to come back to him again and again. I think there's some things which he said in his evidence which I think we'll get the significance of later on when we hear more evidence of other officers from around his time of deployment. Because the way in which this tranche of the inquiry is split up, it doesn't necessarily follow that we're going to hear everything in sort of like a chronological order, as is the idea. Phase 2 is going to include officers that were deployed before and after him, just because they're more significant. I'm sure there's more to learn and understand. All the live evidence that's been put online by the Undercover Policing Inquiry, this is probably some of the most interesting to look at, particularly the afternoon session. Okay, thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be back covering the Undercover Police Inquiry live on Twitter, doing reaction videos on Facebook straight afterwards, and then doing Twitter Spaces in the evening, all for the rest of this phase of hearings and all the phases of all the hearings until this roller coaster comes to an end. If you'd like to contribute anything, please get in touch. Please share this and any of the other stuff that we're putting out. Use the hashtag SpyCops. If you'd like to support the show in any way, you can do. Just go to ko-fi.com/Tom B. Fowler. You're more than welcome to buy me a coffee. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.